lists of shame, authors we feel we should have read, people who are in the canon. They are so troublesome. My view is that you should make your own canon. But of course, everybody feels that pressure to read things which are supposedly classics. A classic which came late to me as an SF reader was Theodore Sturgeon's More Than Human from 1953, which I probably read in my sort of early 20s and didn't get on with. And as my good friend Graham Bray, he the other grumpy old man who appears on this channel sometimes with me, said, maybe it's something you should read when you're 14. And I think he may well have had a point. And Sturgeon's always had a huge amount of acclaim from people like Delaney, Ellison, a lot of the key critics, and he's always really sort of troubled me. I've never quite got what is supposed to be so great about him. I see flashes of it. So recently I decided I would reread and read some Sturgeon I hadn't sort of got around to, and looked at some of the major works. And I will say first of all that maybe it's just that I don't like caviar. I've never eaten it. Have you tried caviar? Maybe I have, I can't recall, but it's fish eggs, isn't it? But let's talk about Sturgeon. He was born in 1918, died in 1985, so he was quite young. My first experience of him was seeing the TV movie version of Killdozer on TV, which is about the bulldozer that comes to life, that is possessed of an alien intelligence, and this would have been in the mid-70s, and great idea. And there is a story of it which is good as well, and he actually drove a bulldozer at one point. You know, why not turn your life into stories? I completely agree with that. You know, that's what Hemingway said, isn't it? So, but his key period really was 1946 to 1961, and in that time he wrote most of his major works. He was always a lot more prolific as a short story writer than a novelist. And I think the collected stories, I think it's going to run, I don't know if they're all out yet, there's a lot of them. It runs to something like 13 volumes. So, you know, when you're judging a writer, you can't just go by the novels, you've got to look at other things as well. So maybe I need to read a lot more of the short stories. And that's certainly where I feel I'm lacking in my reading of Sturgeon. So if I read more, that's what it will be. And you notice I say if I read more, because he does have that sort of impact on me, but I don't always want to read more when I've read him. So let's talk about him. His sort of key theme really in his major books seems to be about sort of outsiders, wastrels and derelicts who are sort of alienated from society, and they gradually find transcendence through kind of communal things. It's a big thing. So there is kind of influence on Silverberg in a way, though Silverberg is much more for the individual, and I much prefer that. I mean, Silverberg is not your sort of Gestalt entity sort of guy. So that's a big thing for Sturgeon. So we just want to talk through some of his work, and instead of starting with More Than Human, I'm really going to sort of look at his work in kind of chronological order. And I've really recently just read for the first time, and this has been on the list forever, this book here, The Dreaming Jewels, and this is an old Dell paperback I bought fairly recently, also known as The Synthetic Man. This was 1950, and this I think is his best novel of the ones I've read, and I've read 4 of his novels, and you know, some of the short stories, as I say. And the thing with this is, as soon as I started reading it, I was reminded of another book which I read recently, which I covered in the Grumpy Old Men Reviews video quite recently, which was Tom Reamy's Blind Voices. I know it's got a dull cover. I'll put the more interesting penguin one up there, because as I said when I reviewed this, this is a book set around the visit of a carnival and freak show to a small American town in the 20s. And a lot of this, especially in the early part, is set at a carny as well. So there's that Bradbury thing. So there's that carnivalesque thing, not in a postmodern way, in a literal way of, you know, circus freaks and that sort of thing. I know we shouldn't say that these days. It would be something different, but that's what it was then. So let's not sort of, you know, wallpaper over the cracks. Let's call it what it was and the way people called it then. So it's exploitation, terrible thing. Anyway, Dreaming Jewels, it's about a young lad who, he's in an orphanage. He is put with this dreadful couple, and they horribly abuse him, and he manages to escape from them, and he loses part of his hand in doing so. And he's got this toy called Junkie, and shades of William Burroughs, and there's Junkie on the back of the book. He's spooky looking, isn't he? And he's basically a jack-in-the-box with these sort of scary eyes, and he's always been with the boy who's called Horty in the orphanage and what have you, and that's sort of mysterious thing. And basically Horty gets into trouble with his surrogate parents, who are absolutely vile, because he's been doing something disgusting, and you immediately think of something sexual, but it's not. He's been eating ants, and you think, eating ants? And he does the classic thing of running away, and he ends up entirely by default joining a carnival, and there's other people in this carnival who are outsiders. I won't tell you too much about the plot. There's certain sort of key characters. You see this theme in a lot of Sturgeon's work, of these outsiders coming together with other outsiders and forming this sort of cabal, and there's usually a science fiction undertone, and this is what you get in Blind Voices as well. And as I said when I reviewed this is very much definitely science fiction, and it seems to me that the influence of the Dreaming Jewels on this is absolutely massive. This is more evenly written, however, but it is undeniable that Remy must have been a huge fan of this book, I'm sure. And as I say, the VT of this is the synthetic man, and that's kind of a clue to what's going on. Quite a different title, The Dreaming Jewels, because this is set around these crystalline forms of life which are on Earth, and they are in the background, and they're developing in their own way, and they're probably ignorant of humanity, except now and again they interfere. And in a way, that theme of the book reminds me of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and of course it's just before that We Are Property thing happened. And I really enjoyed this up to a point. I felt it was more focused and sharper and more on the button in terms of getting the style and the plot balanced than the other works I've read by him. And that's usually my problem. Stylistically, he does sort of fly off the handle at times, and I find him rather uneven. But I have to say, by the last 10 pages, I kind of had enough. And why was that? Well, I think with Sturgeon, he sometimes has a fine sensibility, and he can write really, really well. And he wants to say subtle, clever, transcendent things, but he's rather sort of hamstrung by some kind of gosh wow over-emoting, which is very pulpy and adolescent. And I think that's probably his weakness, but that would have been a strength to young readers in the Golden Age, as he started his career in the Golden Age in the late 30s with Ether Breather and Astounding, did a small amount of work and then went off and then came back to SF in about 46, just when the Golden Age was sort of closing off, really. And this is an issue, you know, he wants to say supernal, transcendent, transformative things, but he lacks the discipline and silvery finesse of, say, Silverberg. And that's a great thing. He wants to say great things, he can't quite do it. And sometimes he's very Stapledonian, very cosmic, too much so perhaps, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So he has this very voluptuous style, and it sometimes overwhelms the formality and inventiveness of the structure of his stories, and he plots very well. He does plot very well, but it's how he articulates the plot is the problem for me. So this is very lush and rich and charming, inventive, bags of ideas, some really, really good ones, wonderful characters, but sometimes it goes a little bit too far. And in a way, I feel this is a book I wish that had been sort of rewritten and not expanded so much, but rewritten, and had some sort of things rubbed off it, you know, a little bit of sort of fine craftsmanship work on there. And this could have had the sort of power that, say, Daniel Keyes had in Flowers for Algernon, but it didn't. It's got a lot more ideas and a lot wilder, but it's not formally as perfect. But this for me was a favourite one. This is the most recent one I've read. So it's the reading of this, despite my misgivings towards the end, that has made me think that I will return to Sturgeon, but focus on short stories. So that was a really key book for him. The next book, which was The One, and it's the only one still in print, and it's in all the reference books. It's in my reference book, despite some misgivings, probably because it does feel like one of those things that should be there, because when you look at Sturgeon in relation to the other key figures who were in that issue of Astounding that launched the Golden Age: Asimov, Heinlein and Van Vogt. He's certainly the finest prose stylist. He's probably the most inventive, but he isn't essentially the most disciplined. I would say Asimov's the most disciplined, Heinlein's the steeliest, Van Vogt is the wildest, and for that I love Van Vogt, despite the crudity sometimes of the prose. Because without Van Vogt we wouldn't have had Philip K. Dick. You know, there's no doubt that Van Vogt inspired Dick and Malmesbury and a lot of the absolute greats. So in a way, Sturgeon's the kind of literary one. And anyway, going back to this other book, the other book is called More Than Human. And I don't have More Than Human as a singleton. I used to have the Gollancz, not Masterwork, the predecessors of the Masterworks, Gollancz Classic SF one. That was one I read back in the 80s, and I didn't really get on with it. But it is in this lovely sterling anthology here from Library of America. They've done 4 of these, and these are great. And this has got some fantastic stuff in it. This is a 50s one. Space Merchants, Paul and Kornbluth, great stuff. More Than Human, Long Tomorrow by Lee Brackett, which you can get as a singleton paperback these days. And best of all, The Shrinking Man by Richard Matheson, which is absolutely marvellous. Such a moving and such a clever book, but we'll talk about that another time. If you ever only read one Matheson, and you've got to read I Am Legend, you really must read The Shrinking Man. It is really quite something. It elevates the idea of just somebody shrinking, which is brilliant, marvellous metaphor, and an amazing SF idea into art. And it really is quite something. It really is very moving, and it does make you think about the smallness that it infects all our lives in lots of ways. But anyway, More Than Human's in this, and I reread it in this a couple of years ago. Again, I was struck by the unevenness of it, and the basic idea is of a Gestalt entity, and that was a big thing for Sturgeon, as I say, where you have this half dozen characters and they're all outsiders. One of them is like a baby. There's a couple of twins, 2 young coloured girls who can teleport or telekinetic, and they've all got these different psychic, psionic or mutant abilities, but they're only really powerful when they mesh together. And there's one of the outsiders, this great big hulking being, and under the command of the baby, who's like a living computer, he builds this machine, and the building of this machine in this rural location is just absolutely wonderful, and it's quite harsh and hard, and you can feel the coldness and the rawness of the muscle in this being. And you eventually work out this machine is never properly really used, and you're wondering what it is, and when you work out what it is, it's absolutely fantastic, and that is one of the good parts. This was a fix-up. The most famous part is called Baby Makes 3, and I think that's the second part of the novel, and that appeared in Galaxy in 1952. And I think the problem with it again is that the fullness and floppiness and marshmallow-esque nature of Sturgeon's prose sometimes overwhelms the sort of formality, as I say, of the structure. So it is a shame. He's cloying at times, too cloying, and it's all a little bit ooh, and I find that really hard to take. And this is where I prefer a harder edge thing. And interestingly, I mean, something that he was big on as he went later in his career towards the 60s is he was very big on getting across the idea of sex and sexuality as the key means of human communication above all else. So he was kind of ahead of his time. So if you look at any reference books to talk about sex in SF before the 1960s, Sturgeon and Farmer, the people are always mentioned. So More Than Human, I am going to read it again actually. It's coming to me now that I would like to revisit some parts particularly, but I'm not entirely certain it's the classic that everybody says it is. But those are the 2 sort of early works which really, really matter. Last week before, I read a novella from this collection, The Joyous Invasion, which I picked up recently. I can't think where I got it from. I did say in one of my other videos. And this has 3 novellas in it. And that's kind of ideal for me. I do like a good collection of novellas. And the first story in this, To Marry Medusa, aka The Cosmic Rape, and you will see it fronting collections as the Cosmic Rape, which is a really good title. To Marry Medusa is a bit more subtle. I read this, about 80 pages, it took me about a week because I really struggled with the chewiness of his style and the pyrotechnics, where sometimes the telling of the story was overwhelmed. And I'm somebody who likes style, who likes lyricism, who likes colour, and I think it's an important thing in SF, but I'm also for the incisive as well, and that's why I like short stories and novellas. So it's in there. And the thing with To Marry Medusa is, let me just pop it here on the podium in a private place, is that it's very, very much, again, a Gestalt story. It begins with this portrait of this vile tramp, and you know, that sounds like an awful unkind thing to say, and we live in very politically correct times, and you know, we should feel sympathy for people who are down on their luck and whatever. You know, it could be us and there could be good reasons for it, but at the same time there is a nagging feeling sometimes where some of us will think, well, they're there because they deserve it, which is a horrible thing, but we've all thought that, if we're honest, at some time. And this character called Gerlich, he sort of basically goes around bars and he demands free drinks. He gets thrown out, and he then takes an unfinished hamburger out of a bin and chomps on it, and he ingests something, and it goes from there. And again, you get the whole body snatchers similarity. There's a similar thing that happens in this. So ultimately it ends up with this invasion of hive mind beings, of Gestalt beings from another planet, and that feels very, very Jack Finney, except that's before this. And they come to Earth through the medium of this tramp. They take control of him, and he really is quite unpleasant, and they do kind of transcend him in a way towards the end of the book, and it is reasonably ambiguous at the end whether you should feel sorry for him or whether he's actually moved forward. And it is quite uncomfortable, and that's a good thing about it, because you can see why somebody like Delaney would like it. If you've read a book like The Madman, for example, which has a central character who has sexual encounters with street people, and it's really quite sort of daring and unpleasant at times. So it is both a sort of celebration of what this person could be, and also revealing what they are. So it does sort of pull at you, and it does make you consider your own sort of biases, really, and your own sort of luckiness at your position in society. So it is a thoughtful thing. But there are moments which are seriously overwritten, and as I say, it gets very Stapledonian. But the interesting thing about these hive mind beings is that they cannot conceive of a species like ours which exist independently as individuals. Their experience of life as they move through the cosmos, colonizing, as in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, is that most life forms are Gestalt entities, which I thought was a really good idea. You might want to call that a spoiler, but it is the centre of the book, and I hope that'll draw you in and make you read it. And so I'd love to know what you think, because I was divided about it, but you know, in terms of ideas, it was fantastic. So you do get this thing in him where there's this wonderful theme circulation where he's going and orbiting like a virtual orrery these certain themes and working on it. And I have no problem with an artist doing that. I think most artists, you know, pick an idea or a theme and they look at it from different angles, using sort of different formal approaches to that. And I think that's a fine approach. I think it's a good thing. They can make a list and say, I'm going to do it this way, I'm going to do it that way. And a lot of my favourite SF writers do that. I mean, Barry N. Malzberg, you could say that Barry's books are all the same. They're all different, and yet they're all the same, because there's a kind of tonality to his view of the universe and how the universe treats people and how it's indifferent. And you get this in Sturgeon as well. There's quite different in Sturgeon. You do feel there's something about evolution in his books, you know, very, very much so. And there is a fondness for young characters in them until this stage. You know, this is where things start to mature a bit more. And that's a very golden age thing. When you read things like Jack Williamson's With Folded Hands and the Humanoids, it reads like a children's book. I mean, it's fantastic, but it does read like a children's book. And Bradbury, of course, was big on that to a degree as well. So, you know, there are some hard edge things which are good. And, you know, and I really sort of both enjoyed his characterization of Gerlich the Tramp and also disapproved as well, and it does make me reflect on it. So he does make you think, but it's not always a satisfying, enjoyable reading experience, is what I'm coming to, I guess. Before I go on to the next book, which was a major one in his sort of oeuvre. I want to talk about another book I was reading just before that, which is Solution 3 by Naomi Mitchinson. This is a Dobson first, and this is from about 1963. Isn't that handsome? Naomi Mitchinson is one of those people who, she made a literary figure. I keep looking at this biography of her in work and think I'd like to read it, and I've been aware of her since the 80s, and she wrote loads of books in all sorts of different things. And there's this sort of quotation by her where she said, oh, I'm kind of fed up being ahead of my time. And she lived to a ripe age, and she wrote loads and loads of books, came from a very, very prestigious scientific family and had some training in biology. I think 3 of her relatives were professors, and her brother was JBS Haldane, very noted biologist, and her father was one of the Haldanes as well, obviously, and he was a key biologist as well. And this is about a future where Solution 3 has been employed. And Solution 3 is one of a number of ideas the human race has had to deal with population crashes and rises and the problems that bring for the environment. And the thing with this book is that even though it was published in the 60s, and even though it's unashamedly SF, and she does an introduction, and she's quite happy to be called an SF writer, and she did have a reasonable amount of acclaim for writing SF. She did a book called Memoirs of a Spacewoman as well, which was in Women's Press in the 80s. I've got that somewhere too, and I think there's 1 or 2 other minor ones. And she, wanted to use science. She said, I'm from a scientific family, and I'm used to biology, and this is about cloning. And the basic idea is that Solution 3 is that there are these 2 people, and they're like the Adam and Eve of the new society. And they decide that the way forward for mankind to control itself and to control population in the face of the ruined environment is very, very much for people to clone themselves, but for only these 2 people to be cloned. So the man is a man of colour, and he is cloned again, and the woman is cloned as well. And they're gradually building up, and these clones, they sort of running this international society, and there's only about 80 of each sex. There's only about 80 of them, and there are a cache of mothers who are looking after clones. They're not brought up by their own surrogate mothers because it's proper scientific cloning. It's not just like they pop off and they're fully grown. They have to be in wombs and what have you. And there's a lot of background about crop yields, and this is working on that, and that's really quite dull. And what this reminded me of, more than anything else, it's got the kind of stainless steel attitude and old-fashioned nature, really, of Brave New World. It very much felt like a book from the 20s or 30s, even though it was the 60s. The science is more evolved. There's more about chromosomes and things. But it has to be said, it really did feel like a book that was, and I don't use the word dated, but it felt behind its time. And if you compare this to what was about to happen in British New Wave SF, where you were going to get this marriage of good literary writing with scientific extrapolation, looking at where society was, this felt very staid. And it's a utopian novel, and the problems with utopian novels is that they are didactic and they do tend to lecture you. And it's as Michael Moorcock said in the Hawkwind song he wrote, Arrival in Utopia, because we don't like it here, there's nothing left to fear, bored mindless in Utopia. And it does feel a bit like a sort of finger pointing schoolmaster exercise. So I did get rather fed up with this. I found it a bit irksome, so I put it down. I haven't finished it, but what's the most interesting thing about this is that the rebels in this are called professorials, academics, who they refuse to go for this cloning thing. They're still having normal babies. And what's interesting is this is the world, different parts of the world is in different stages. And, for example, Africa is still doing things the old-fashioned way. And you're not seeing like this utopia imposed from above. It's an experiment, and they're trying to get it done. So it's all very sort of non-malevolent and kind, but there's this sort of strangeness of the clones, and they can't relate to this idea of having individuality. And some of them have more idea about falling in love and being normal in the old sort of Solution 1 and 2 phase and what have you. So it does have lots of interesting ideas, but I did find it rather irksome. Now, I've mentioned it because in the context of Sturgeon, it brings me on to this book, Venus plus X, which is widely regarded as arguably his most important book. Now, Venus plus X, cracking cover, that I do like that. Again, I started to read this and I really enjoyed it to begin with. It does suffer a little from the slightly gimcracky sort of thing. I don't know what it is about names. What is it about names in 50s SF? All these Sams and Charlies and that. None of them have cool names, but I guess it's an attempt to sort of draw in the regular reader. Now, it's very shallow, I know, so I shouldn't go on about that. But this is about a guy called Charlie Johns, and he wakes up in this room and he doesn't know where he is. And it turns out that he thinks he's been brought forward in time to this model society called LEDOM, Ledom, which is model backwards. And he gets introduced to people there, and he begins to realize that even though they look like men, that they're not men, and they don't seem to be any women anywhere. And the people are very benign, and they say the reason they've got him there is because they want to know what he thinks of their society. And the society is quite new, and he and you assume that it's in the distant future. And there's only about 800 of these people. So there are similarities to Solution 3, as I say. It's a small scale sort of thing that's going on, a small scale experiment. And these people are hermaphrodites. These days there's a habit to say intersex. You know, and I mean, okay, it's a fair term. It's probably more of an acronym in some ways, but we've had the word hermaphrodite for a long time. Now, the number of people who are actually hermaphroditic, who are born with both male and female genitals, is very, very small indeed. And usually at birth, some decision is made by medical authorities. And this is we get into the whole cisgender debate, which we're not going to go into about this. But something I saw on television a very long time ago, must have been 25 years ago, maybe longer, was a fascinating documentary, I wish I could remember what it's called, about a Pacific island where everybody who's born is born female, and some of them, by the time they're 5, 6 year old, begin to sprout male genitals. And it's really interesting. And the beings in Ledom are hermaphroditic. They're self-fertilizing, what have you, but they do have relationships and things, and they're very wise and they're dedicated to the arts. But you do find, even though Charlie's quite a progressive sort of guy, you do find yourself balking, and you think there's something behind this. And, you know, this is a textbook perfect society, and what is going on here? And there is indeed something behind it. There is a worm in the apple, as there so often is in SF. And, you know, that the stuff this comes in which upsets the narrative is really good. And it is a fairly short book, which I like, and there's a certain amount of sharpness, but there are moments about children singing and the artistic and religious life, which again, this is where Sturgeon's weakness comes about. He gets all very cloudy and pastel coloured and emotive, and you know, and it is kind of fit into the material, but I just find it really irritating to read, and you just want to see things being upset. And this is where, as a 50s writer about sex in SF, and this is really important, this is 1960, and as I say, he's always mentioned and Farmer's always mentioned, I much prefer Farmer. Now, you could say the Farmer is more direct, more assaultive, more male, more aggressive, and all those things would be absolutely true. And his visions are more directly dangerous. Sturgeon's are dangerous as well because they have very wide-leaning implications. But Farmer puts the grit in, and you get a sort of authentic feel of that. And I certainly feel that from a male perspective, and maybe that's me. Sturgeon really did seem to think, you know, that things were changing and the gender was changing. So he is kind of an author who I think could be rediscovered in a big way, except I think this is out of print. You get an ebook probably. And, you know, he is somebody who could be a prophet of the current sort of age we're in a way. I liked it, but again, it was overwhelmed by those things. So I think when it comes into the sort of thing about getting sexuality and sex into 50s SF, I think Farmer was more direct and more shocking. And I just think it needed a bit of taboo breaking then. And Ballard, of course, was at her as well in a subtler way in the Vermilion Sand stories, you know. So that was the thing. But this, again, as a utopian novel, I found it rather irksome. But I wonder whether she ever read it. Who can say? Very similar things. Utopia novels, very difficult to write. And Emma Newman says she's writing one. So if you haven't seen my interview with Emma on the channel, do watch it. She's a great lady. I wonder if she's getting on with that. I must ask her. So those were sort of all key things for Sturgeon. Where do I stand now? I want to revisit More Than Human. it is obviously a key book in influencing things like the X-Men. And I mean, and I've mentioned this many times, you go right the way back, you go to Slan by Ivan Vogt, you go to Mutant by Henry Kuttner. You know, these are things which spawned the X-Men, and that in the popular imagination, especially the film versions, is where this sort of, you know, this superpowered outsider thing, it's an old SF idea, you know, that's the thing. And, you know, I love the X-Men. I've had letters published in X-Men and everything, a long time ago, mind. But that's where I am on Sturgeon. These themes of gender, of Gestalt, of quite fine structures but rather overwritten and too flavoursome at times, too romantic at times, and not sort of hard and pointed enough. But you can see why a younger generation of writers like Silverberg and Ellison and Delaney would have revered him. So the jury is still out for me, so I guess I'll reread More Than Human at some point, or at least the parts which I think are really good, and look at the short stories. I just want to add that I've forgotten, because I don't have a copy of it. I used to have a copy of it and I let it go. His final sort of important novel, really, 1961, Some of Your Blood, which is a vampire novel. And that, again, that was probably something I want to go back to, and I was going to pick a copy up either in Hay or from Bob, and I didn't get around to it, so I must get one. Some of Your Blood, it's quite uncommon now. It did get a reissue in paperback a few years ago. It's probably print on demand or something. And that's a sort of study of a guy who is under therapy, who has this psychopathology, who thinks he's a vampire, he wants to drink blood. And he's more like your sort of low-level, sparse serial killer sort of types. You know, it's quite a realistic narrative, and you've got him being analysed and his hunger and things. And that came across quite well. But in a way, the problem with Some of Your Blood was that where it lacked some of the floridness of the earlier work, the sort of structural strength wasn't there so much. But I'm going to go back to that. So that's Some of Your Blood. I'll try and stick a picture up on the screen if I haven't done that already. I know usually by the time I say that, I've got one up. So this is Outlaw Bookseller, signing up for now. That's my look at Theodore Sturgeon. More SF to come. Please comment, like, subscribe, super thanks, all that stuff. And I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.